Hi. As Devorah usually says, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Tending Lilith's Fire, episode 2. I'm Kohenet Matan, and I'm here with Kohenet Devorah Grenn. And today,
we're going to be talking about vulnerability from many different fronts. And Annie's going to start us off with a discussion of the Pisces energy now present.
Yes. So we are recording under I want to say a Pisces sun and approaching, if not in, a Pisces moon. So we've got double Pisces energy. And Pisces is a water sign. Water is connected to the realm of emotion. And the feeling of Pisces is like swimming in the collective. It can be very ephemeral. The veil is thin. We have easier access to communication with our ancestors and the spirit world and source. So that might be coming up in dreams. And yeah, that vulnerability is like emotions are very close to the surface right now. And before we started recording, Devorah and I were like, what do we want to talk about today? And Devorah said, oh, maybe vulnerability. And I said, well, that's up because of this, this time in Pisces. So if you're feeling it too, I just want you to know, I was just speaking with a friend right before our meeting today, and she also was talking about feeling very emotional and vulnerable and overwhelmed and not quite sure why. And I was like, oh, it sounds like you're right in alignment with the astrology right now. So if that's happening for you, know that you're just really tuned into the cosmos, tuned into the collective. And I'm finding that helpful as I'm also navigating emotions very close to the surface and feeling stirred up about a lot of things.
Yes. Yes, and I'm feeling that as well. So interesting to hear you say that about emotions being close to the surface. And sometimes, although I also feel that at full moon, I think I feel it at new moon if I want to have my own space and be completely alone and have my solitude, which I don't have. So although most of the time in pandemic, I'm very grateful I don't have it. I think it's a time of both those, going into both of those moon cycles, high sensitivity, at least for me. And vulnerability came up a couple of times this week in conversations, the most recent of which was right before we met also, where a friend was asking what was keeping me from wanting to share some of my deeper writings that I started a couple of years ago. And so the word vulnerability came up, and I even find addressing the word difficult in this moment, and sometimes, because I like to control things in my own sphere, less than I did 20 years ago, when I would have probably been called a control freak by a couple of people I can think of. But I still like to know an outcome. You know, I get very attached to outcome, and I like to feel at least in control of myself and my emotions. And for that reason, another thing that came up yesterday is that I, like the woman I was talking to, don't cry easily, because we, for various reasons, and part of that is about being vulnerable. But I think for myself and for other women I've worked with and known over the years, it's a feeling that we will lose control of ourselves and not be able to stop crying once we start, or not be able to stop having those deep emotions, which can be scary and which are really also very important. I've had a couple of moments during the pandemic when I've had what I termed a meltdown, and it really was just being able to cry for 10 or 15 minutes and feeling so much better afterwards and the next day, that it reminded me that it's a cleansing and it's really important. Our tears are really important. And for some of us, they're just not easy to access. So there's one aspect of vulnerability, or several.
I forgot, before we started recording, I said, oh, I really am excited to say, we are engaging in this conversation in Lilith's name. And that came up as I was listening to you. I was like, well, what would Lilith have to say about this? And I think in her story, her breaking, when you were describing it, you're like, oh, I've had some meltdowns, which was really letting myself cry. And there's a way in which, the not letting us cry is a keeping us down, right? Like a repression of our experience, a repression of our emotions. And it occurred to me, you know, in Lilith's story, she was like, nope, you will not hold me down. Nope, you will not be on top. You will not hold me down. You will not dominate. I get to be free and fully expressive. So this feels like such an important and poignant point. Like the expression is not always about expression in our power, expression in our anger or our rage or our, you know, bigness. Sometimes it's expression in our vulnerability too, and being allowed to be vulnerable, being allowed to cry.
Yes.
And
And,
yeah.
and my first internal response when you said, what would she say? Is that she would say, I'm not crying. The hell with that, you know, and she would go to that place of rage and anger and action. And that's usually been my go-to. So it is a challenge, and maybe that's, I won't challenge her to do it in this moment, but I will challenge myself perhaps to let it occur more often. Because especially at times like this, when emotions are close to the surface, it should be easier to access. And I think if we give ourselves permission, yeah, then maybe it will happen more readily. Whoever we are embodying, or you know, whatever orishas or goddesses we are looking to for models.
That's so interesting that I'm like, wow, okay, hold on, go back. So you feel like Lilith would repress her sadness, transmute it into anger, and be like, no, I'm not going to cry.
I'm not doing that. I'm leaving.
No, I'm not doing that. Well, I'm not doing that. I'm leaving for sure. And it's so cool that we have, like, I don't feel that way about Lilith. Like, and I was going to say, I wonder if I'm curious about I love that we have a multi-generational relationship. And, you know, I was like, wow, I think younger people are learning something different about tears than even I did. And I will not ask you to share your age, but I'm comfortable sharing that I'm 41 at this point. And so like I grew up with a don't cry, you know, training around, like, not exactly big girls don't cry, but it was like, there's no good reason to cry for you to be crying right now, that message. So it also took me a while to feel like it was okay to have those full emotions. And for me, like, I want to look at Lilith as a model, not only of that fiery rage, but also of just like the fullness of expression as a person and as a woman.
Yes.
And so for me, the fullness of expression includes, I get to feel all my feelings. So for me, like, I can take her anger, like the model of her anger and her rage and her I'm out of here, as like, F you, I'm going to get to feel everything and you can't tell me different.
It's interesting.
I don't want to feel that part, you know. I'm like, I take the, like, don't make me repress any part of myself for you. I'm going to get to feel all of it.
It's interesting because often I think over my life and seeing other women as well, anger can be expressed in tears, but the tears are very brief and it's not weeping and wailing and really processing. Also, I just have to say it's not a generational thing, I think, because even though I'm in a different generation, I had a German father, and later after my mom died a number of years later, he remarried a Swiss German woman, and both of them had this attitude of, it was just a matter of showing strength. Not only didn't you cry, but you didn't let anything stop you. You could be sick, you still go to work. You know, it was that kind of that mentality. Yeah.
No, I think we're in the same, in that way, we're both of the old paradigm.
Yeah.
In that particular conditioning. But I think, and I'm curious, if you're watching this and you're younger and you had or not of any age, if you had a different experience and you believe that I'm wrong, my sense now, especially in facilitating groups in which I'm often the elder in the group, I'm seeing that there's more comfort with tears. There's more comfort with, and it's also my own that I facilitate intentionally so that people can feel all their feelings. So I'm probably seeing more of that in the spaces that I'm in. But not only where I'm facilitating, but groups that I'm participating in, especially with younger adults, it looks to me like there has been a shift in the way we parent. And also, as a parent who's immersed in parenting blogs, there's a lot about letting our kids feel their feelings. And so I do think there's been a shift. So maybe what that means is, you know, now people a generation younger than me, or, you know, over the next several years, when folks are having these conversations about vulnerability, these goddess, it'll be like, of course I cried.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want that for both boys and girls.
Yeah, I want for everybody, all genders. Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think
yeah, absolutely.
one thing we need to keep doing, encouraging men to feel free to do that and not feel less than a man in that traditional way. It's interesting you mentioned the groups that you lead, because in my teaching, I do, and my circles, I do the same thing. I definitely encourage women to cry and show emotion, and sometimes somebody will start breaking down and apologize, and I always tell them, please, you know, it's all welcome here. And yet that's one, although I model a lot of behavior and teachings for my students, that's not one, except there is one exception, I have to say, and I'll be doing this tomorrow with a new group I'm working with, and that is when I model a spiritual autobiography and what that looks like, because there's no way I get through telling mine without tears. So that now that I think of it, that is one exception. It's also one place I allow myself to be publicly vulnerable. So yeah.
Well, that's cool. I'm glad you have a space where you can allow yourself to be publicly vulnerable. And you said something about like the cleansing. What did you say about like having a good cry?
Yeah, which I also did once. I remember being in deep grief over someone's death. I must have cried and wept in the sense of almost wailing for about half an hour. And even though it was painful, the next day, even though I was waking up with bleary eyes and all that, I felt that there's a great sense of release and relief. So it is a really important tool for our mental and emotional health, for sure, and spiritual health.
Yeah, and that made me think of also years ago, gosh, it's been 10 years, I think. A friend of mine died, and she worked, she was a social worker with Native family and child, and we had a memorial for her in a sacred lodge in their building, and people were crying and apologizing for crying, and, you know, we were like teary and snotty, and one of her colleagues said, so her name was Elisa, and one of her colleagues said, like, Elisa would say, like, let the tears come, the tears are cleansing. So whenever I hear someone make that reference, it reminds me of her, and that I got to learn that lesson from her, even in grieving for her. So since then, I sort of hear it in her voice, being like, it's okay, let the tears come, I'll let it all out. It's all cleansing, and it's all sort of it's a sacred it's a sacred experience to let ourselves have.
And certainly not approved of, I'm sorry, not one that is approved of in business, for example. I remember once a job I held as an executive for about 5.5 years. And one time in that whole period, I did get tears in my eyes. I forget what the reason was in the moment, but I remember just being mortified and mad at myself that I had let that happen, because I knew it would be taken by the folks I did it in front of as a sign of weakness, or even, you know, that maybe I wasn't right for the job. Although I didn't think that at the time, I'm thinking it as looking in retrospect, but I knew it would be regarded certainly as a sign of weakness, which is
and
changing. Yeah.
Thankfully that's changing, and also for clergy, right? For spiritual leaders, because when I facilitated a memorial for a friend and colleague years ago, and one of my colleagues and friends who I worked with, she said before we started, you know, we gathered, it was a gathering for memorial at work, and, you know, I was at the time, I was newly ordained as a Kohenet. I don't think I had facilitated, or maybe I was still in training. I hadn't facilitated a funeral yet, but it was clear like I was the right person to do this for my colleague. And this other colleague said, look, you just can't cry when you do this. Like you can, like you have to hold this space for everyone else, and you can't be the one crying right now. You've got to hold it together. And I understood where she was coming from, but I couldn't do it. Like I couldn't get through talking about her, about this person that I loved and was with, like through the process of her dying. She had cancer, and I felt like I had failed when I couldn't keep it together and talking about her. And it's interesting because you bringing up your experience as an executive makes me think of that. And I remember thinking, oh, I couldn't do it. I failed, you know. And nowadays I notice when I'm facilitating, like my tears are very close to the surface most of the time. I don't have any trouble crying. And I notice, I hear from folks in the spaces I facilitate that when that happens, when I cry, when I'm vulnerable and authentic in that vulnerability, they say that it gives them permission to do the same. And that they appreciate that I'm real.
Yeah.
And I always, so I just want to name, like, I really appreciate hearing that from those folks. And I'm always holding anxiety about it. Oh no, I've taken up this space with my feelings. Mm-hmm. And I want to name that that's part of the conditioning, is like, there's no room for you to have feelings. That's not what you're here for. You're here for other people's feelings, right?
Yeah. I think that's really important. And also it's like making a mistake. When we used to teach in an academic program, we would let students see if we made a mistake, and we would sometimes really flesh it out and discuss what happened so that they wouldn't feel too embarrassed, to ever admit making a mistake, and also so they wouldn't be afraid to take risks in their work. Yeah.
Did that change? Like when you say we used to be transparent about making mistakes?
No, only that the program no longer exists. No, I mean, when the program existed and we were several of us teaching together. Yeah. Yeah, no, I still do. I have no problem being vulnerable around mistakes I've made. And in fact, sometimes I bring up particular, there are a couple of big ones in my life. One of them in business for sure, that was a great teaching and worth it, worth all the embarrassment and shame and whatever I felt in the moment. It was worth it because it's such a teaching, Yeah.
That's awesome. It makes me think about my vulnerability in the last 12 to 24 hours has had a lot to do with confronting my perfectionism. And I felt I made a mistake in a space I was facilitating. And I was like, but I pride myself on being good at this. So what does it mean if I screw up? And I was transparent about it at the time, but I couldn't let it go. I was feeling a lot of shame. And just noticing how hard I am on myself about like the standards I hold myself to in my leadership work, in my facilitation work, in my space holding work. And then I was like, oh, where else is this true? In my parenting, and how like I could see, I'm grateful I had a space where I could process that in a mentorship group I'm a participant in. And I was like, wow, I can see how intensely ingrained that perfectionism is in me. Like it felt so scary to make a mistake, to believe I had made a mistake. And, today I heard from someone who was involved that she didn't feel like I felt like I'd wronged someone, and they felt like I had not. But I still am like, yeah, but I could have done better. Like no matter what anyone else tells me, I'm having a hard time letting go of the belief that it wasn't my fault, that I didn't do something wrong, because it wasn't it didn't feel like I held it perfectly. And like, what's the thread here is, it's just it's very intense. That conditioning of like the standards we have to hold ourselves to, of the power we are supposed to show, or the way we show up, or the way we hold others, and where there is room to let that go or not. And that's been a theme for me, is in my life, has been the belief that I can't afford to let go. I can't afford to stop.
I think this is part of the inner critic that women have so strongly, and part of our work to let go of that, or at least to recognize that's what we're hearing. And I have to just say, listening to you discuss this and knowing what your gifts are, that the other side of this is what makes us good at our work is this level of sensitivity. I don't think it's only perfectionism, although that's in there, but it's a high sensitivity or sensibility. And so I'm the same way. For example, if I think I've hurt someone's feelings or different situations, and it will just sit with me until I deal with it in some way. And if the only way we can deal with it, if we maybe never find out how the other person felt, at some point we have to forgive ourselves and move on, but it's not easy. But it's also our strength. That is what I just wanted to say to you, that sensitivity. It can be our torture, but it can also be a strength.
Yes, thank you for naming that it can be, that it's a strength. I really appreciate you saying that. And also really appreciate you saying it can be our torture as well as our strength, because for sure I was torturing myself. And I was like, how do I get out of this? And I feel like I want to name, like, I knew I needed to shift the energy because it wasn't going to be solved externally. I needed to address it in myself. And because our conversation started with priestessing the priestesses and how do we priestess ourselves in hard times, you know, I want to say, like, I took a shower, I played games on my phone, like I reached out for support. And I didn't try to do it all by myself. So like first I reached out for support, actually. Then I was like, I'm still feeling shame and I'm still feeling lousy. So then I took a shower to try and like shake things up for me. And I was having trouble sleeping. So I gave myself permission. I'm just going to play games on my phone until I get sleepy. And it worked. And then waking up today, it like the angst of it, is that the right word? Like the intensity of it was cleared by the time I woke up this morning, even before there was resolution.
Great. Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess the thing is, like, we don't have to power through even
right.
those moments.
Exactly that. Exactly. But rather take good care of ourselves. And I think the bathing in whatever form we do that, shower, bath, whatever, is critical piece of that. Yeah.
Right. A clearing. I was like, I need a clearing, but I couldn't, like, I don't want to use Palo Santo or, you know what, I have sage Palo Santo incense, you know, those kinds of things around, but it didn't feel like the right thing. I wanted something that was a more embodied experience.
Yeah. And one could also do both, you know, sage.
Of course. Yeah, that was my choice, but you can do whatever works for you. Yes. Yeah. Yes. I'm curious, Devorah, about when you said, if we go way back to the topic of vulnerability came up because you were having a conversation with someone about some of your writing, and that the reason you don't want to share that is because it feels too vulnerable. And a question occurred to me to ask you, like, what does vulnerable mean to you in that context? Can you?
Part of it is privacy, that I have been very private, less so since we've been doing these conversations, which I thank you for, and different people pushing me to put myself out there more. But being still basically very private, some of those writings are about my marriage, which I don't always want to talk about. And yet in the places where it was psychologically or emotionally abusive, I know that there is a reason to do it. And so I will be pushing that aside and just letting some of the work go out, because I know it can help other women. And one of my key fires in my belly.
So what I'm hearing is, for you, what feels particularly vulnerable is sharing like parts of you that you've kept private and just for you. And is there, and you're like, well, there might be some parts that will benefit others. So I'll challenge myself, you know, to grow that comfort zone. Were there any other nuances to that that you want to share about what is it? Just the privacy, or is there more?
That it's very personal. Some of it's very personal. So, but that's tied to the privacy. I don't know how else to explain that. Tied to, parts of my personal life, which generally, at least for many years, I didn't share very much, which was also, let's say, an outcome of being in this kind of marriage, of believing in the myth of romantic love to the point of, when we first were married, and my husband saying, we don't need anybody else. It's just the two of us. It's so romantic, this idea, which is why, I often try to disabuse girls of that notion. It is a myth, that kind of romantic love that isolates you or that in any way would denigrate you if it isn't supporting you and feeding you. It is not romantic love. It's not even love. It's control, power, and control that someone's trying to. What they said softened me just even in this conversation. So I did come out as a survivor years ago, and I was publicly on panels with Shalom Bayit and other groups, and it was hard, but I also knew it was very important. And so that's gotten easier over the years, and that certainly is a private thing. But there have been certain aspects to my writing, that I guess reveal more of my own aspects that I'm just not ready to share. But at the rate I'm going, I'm sure it will all be shared over the next couple of years. Especially if I'm pushing women to share their own writings. Because one thing I did find was very important. This one chapter that I wrote in a book called Original Resistance is one of these examples where it took me years to write the material, and then it took me another few months to change it from being in the third person to first person, which makes the writing much more powerful for the reader. And I did allow it to be shared at my local college when they did a domestic violence exhibit called, and rape exhibit really, What Was She Wearing? Wonderful exhibit that showed, outfits like very baggy clothes, nothing sexy. And how people ask, that's the first question often if somebody's raped, right? So I allowed them to share my piece there. They wanted to put it on a board. And I said, just don't put my name, because I was teaching at that college at that time. And I didn't feel that would be useful or appropriate. But that was a big step, even allowing the words to be out there. And so each step, each of those additional, peeling away each of those additional layers, it gets a bit easier.
Yeah, I hear you. And about each step makes it easier. And I wonder, one of the things I think a lot about in New Paradigm Life is the idea of growing our comfort zone, like expanding our comfort zone around where we want to get to, rather than transgressing the boundary of our comfort zone to get to where we want to get to. And so, I feel like for you, being in spaces where you're encouraging others to share is helping you expand your comfort zone. And I wonder what else, if you look at it from that perspective, rather than pushing yourself to do something that you don't feel ready for, what could help you feel ready?
So
and from there.
I'm wondering about how you're making that distinction between transgressing one's own boundaries. How is that different from expanding?
So for me, transgressing is like jumping off a cliff, the leap of faith. Just do it. Stepping out, right? So like the language of get out of your comfort zone, that's where growth happens. And I feel like, what if we have a goal in mind, and instead of leaving our comfort zone behind and walking across an expanse to get to that goal, feeling super vulnerable, what if we could imagine growing our comfort zone around the goal by noticing what we need in order to feel more comfortable, in order to feel supported in our vulnerability, or even in order to feel less vulnerable about it. Like if I had someone to hold my hand, it wouldn't feel scary. So I would be still within my comfort zone, for example.
I don't think we always know. I really don't think we always know. And for me, I'm sure different from kind. And it was probably both, the writing of this piece and putting it in, much as a result of being in a writing workshop on sexual abuse and violence, And there was a small group of women. We learned to trust each other. I hadn't known any of them, well, maybe one, but yeah, one who's also an advocate. But the others I didn't know. It was a small, intimate group. I think we were 6. And and so, yes, it felt safe to, I asked if I could workshop the piece in front of them, and they heard it, and I saw how it landed on them. So that encouraged me and pushed me forward. But if I had just said ahead of time, oh, I'll expand my comfort zone by being in a group of like-minded people and a sacred community, that wouldn't have mattered, because yes, they were sacred communities. I was in circles of women, but it wasn't the right time, or I wasn't ready, or, so conditions also have to be right, as well as the intention that you're setting. But a good question. Yeah.
Well, I think those things that you've named, like, are part of the expansion of the comfort zone when it's the, and
Say that again, because you went out. Say that last sentence again.
well, I think those pieces that you're naming, it's not only being in a community of like-minded women. That was part of what did help you get, like, feel more ready. Also, it was just time, and you just felt more ready. Like, your nervous system got to take the time it needed with a variety of different supports so that you could make a choice to do a thing that had felt scary and now felt less scary than it did before. Is that correct?
I would say, yeah.
Rather than being like, this feels scary and I'm just going to do it anyway. And maybe I'm hearing you say there was some of that in there too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I still was going to keep it in third person until a close friend and colleague also said the same thing. Why don't you put it in the first person? And so then I sat with that as well. And that encouraged me. But yeah, I think it's a tough but a good challenge to say to some, to ourselves and to others, how can I expand my comfort zone? I just don't think it always would happen to even that kind of a close intention setting, but just sometimes to get a kick in the pants, as they say.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Some people need the push, and I'm a person who, I hate the push. Like, it really feels like it shuts me down. And I don't ask myself necessarily, what do I need to expand my comfort zone? I might ask myself, what is the most loving thing I can do for myself right now? Or this feels scary. What would help me feel less scared? It can be smaller. It doesn't need to be such a big picture question. And for me, often it's about choice and autonomy and sovereignty, which is very much in Lilith's name, like one of the topics. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about this past week, of experiences we have as children where we are not given a choice, like, this is for your own good experiences. And I'm really challenging that. Maybe that'll be next week. Like, we can talk about that, because I'm still sort of in process. I know for me, one of the things that really expands my comfort zone is feeling like I have agency over my experience. So if I feel like I'm doing it because someone else thinks I should, that feels really hard. If it's an invitation, like, oh, I'd love this, if it feels good to you, then that pulls me forward, like an invitation, like, oh, I'm invited. This also tied into my human design as a projector who needs to be invited. But mostly, I think my sense of agency has an immense impact on where the boundaries of my comfort zone are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, being pushed into something, I probably wouldn't respond either. I'll say one other thing on this, and that is, you mentioned timing. So I think it's timing of our own development, our own, I think a lot of these things get easier as we grow older. But the other key point was being in safe relationship, because as you're in safe relationships that hold you, as I'm in with my partner, we know that we feel safe. Some part of us, subconsciously or otherwise, feels safe enough to let certain things arise and get dealt with and spoken about. And that was a piece, I think, as well. So
that's so lovely. That's such a lovely piece to raise, is when we have examples of what that comfort feels like in other spaces, it gives us the bravery and that the feeling that it's going to be okay for this part to come up now.
Right. So there, I have been vulnerable in our vulnerability broadcast to express.
And thank you.
Thank you for your questions. Yeah.
You're welcome. And I, you know, I feel very much in the collective energy of Pisces. I think that these questions of comfort and vulnerability and how do we handle the emotions that are spilling over right now, all of that is very much up in the collective. So I hope that this conversation has been useful for those of you who are listening. And we'd love to hear in the comments what it's brought, you know, whatever feels safe for you to share, whatever you feel brave to share. And as Devorah mentioned before, even if your voice shakes, we'd love to hear your voice in this conversation about vulnerability and comfort zones and what works for you and what doesn't work for you and where we've gone wrong and where we've gone right.
And if you feel like sharing it, of course, you know, what areas, what times, what situations make you feel, what language make you feel especially vulnerable, if that's something.
Ooh. Wow, what makes you feel vulnerable? That is quite a challenge. I feel like that's quite an invitation. And I would say, what makes you feel vulnerable and what makes you feel supported. If you don't want to share what makes you feel vulnerable, or both.
That's great.
Because you know, we could all be collecting these resources and models. Yeah. Oh yeah, I feel vulnerable there too. Oh yeah, I could use that kind of support too.
Yeah. Great.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us.
Yes, we really love to hear from you.
Great.
Thank
Thanks.
you.
Take care. Till next time.